What is up, guys? Welcome to Bardent. My name is Heinrich, and today we're going to add our core to our enemies. Okay, so we can just go ahead and jump right in. Now, the first thing I want to do is just show you guys a little issue that we currently have with our combat system, and it's best to just demonstrate it quickly. So let's go ahead and open up our combat test dummy script, and in our damage function, let's just go ahead and destroy the dummy when it gets hit. So all we say is destroy game object. Like that. So now when the combat dummy takes damage, the game object will get destroyed. Let's run the game and see what happens. So if we go ahead and just hit the dummy, as you can see, we get an error. So we get this error that says invalid operation exception, collection was modified, and enumeration operation may not execute. Now what this is saying is we're basically trying to loop or enumerate through some collection, but the collection was modified while we were busy looping through it. And that breaks things for us. So what's causing this? Well, with regards to our combat, there's only really one list that we deal with, and that is our hitbox list. So let's go ahead and open up our aggressive weapon, and you see over here we have this list of type I damageable called detected damageables. Now what happens is during the attack, when we get the animation action trigger, we loop through all the detected objects, or all the I damageables in detected damageables, and we call the damage function. So what's happening is when we damage the dummy, we call the damage function on the dummy, and then we come over here to the damage function on the combat dummy, run this code, and over here we destroy the combat dummy, meaning the combat dummy gets removed from the scene. So when the combat dummy gets destroyed, that means that its collider goes with it. And because the collider disappears, that means we trigger that onTriggerExit 2D function. So if we come back to our aggressive weapon, over here we have this remove from detected function, and that gets called from our intermediary, I think, this weapon hitbox to weapon, so over here. So because the game object gets destroyed, we get onTriggerExit 2D, which is like an interrupt. It interrupts the code, and this has to happen before the aggressive weapon finishes looping through this list. I hope that makes sense. So we need to come up with some way to make it okay for us to modify the list without affecting our for each loop over here. And the easiest solution that we have is just to use the system.link library. Now, we're not going to get too much into what the system.link library is. It's a very nice, convenient, and powerful library that we can use. But essentially, it just provides us with a lot of basic functionality that allows us to do some fun things with lists and arrays and dictionaries and things like that. So before I show you how we're going to use it, let's just go ahead and include it in our project. So we just come up here to the top of our aggressive weapon script, because this is where we're going to make use of it, and just say using system.link. L-I-N-Q, like that. So now that we have access to system.link, all we're going to do is come over here to our check melee attack function. So in our for each loop over here, all we have to do is at the end of detected damageables, say dot to list. Like that. So essentially what this does is we're not looping through the original detected damageables. We're looping through a copy of it. So when our remove from detected function gets called, it gets removed from the original detected damageables list, but it doesn't affect our for each loop. And this is perfectly fine. So now you'll see if we go ahead and save this and run the game and hit the dummy now, it disappears, everything works perfectly, no errors. Beautiful. Okay, so that's just the one little issue that we've had with the system so far with a very simple fix. Let's go ahead and move on to the next part. So we're going to be doing some refactoring of our enemies again, just some very basic things. I'm sorry that there's a lot of that going on, but it's for the best. So for now, I'm just going to click on my enemy 2 and disable it, and we're just going to work with enemy 1 and then get everything working there before we just do everything on enemy 2 again. The first thing I want to do is take a look at our hierarchy over here. So as you can see, we have this enemy 1 game object and then this alive game object. Now this isn't really required anymore. The reason we set it up like this was in case we wanted the enemy to break up into separate chunks when it dies and have those go flying in different directions like we originally did with the dummy. But I don't think I'm going to be taking that route anymore, so now this is just kind of redundant. We don't really need to fix it, but we might as well just do it. So what I want to do is I want to make this a live game object, the parent game object. So we need to move this script from enemy1 down to alive. And the easiest way to do that is just to come over here, click on the 3 dots and say copy component, and then click on the alive game object and just click on any of the components and say paste component as new. Now as you see, we have the script here and all the references are already entered like that. Perfect. That means we can now take our alive game object, drag it to root, and then now we can just delete this enemy1 game object. Perfect. Now we can take this alive game object and just rename it to enemy1. Perfect. So now it just makes a little bit more sense. We'll go ahead and do the same thing to enemy2 later in the video. So because we did this, there's just a few things that we have to fix in code. So let's go ahead and open up our entity script. So it's in our enemies folder and then state machine entity over here. And so the main thing is we don't need this public game object, alive game object anymore. We can go ahead and get rid of that and then just fix any parts of the code that use that. So we don't need this line at all anymore. And then for our rigid body, we can just say get component directly, and the same for our animator and the same for our animation to state machine. Now there's some other place in the code that also uses it. Down here in our check wall function, we can just say transform.right. And then in our check player in min aggro, check player in max aggro, check player in close range action. So down here in our damage function, we can go ahead and get rid of this and this. And then we also have one in our flip function. So let's go ahead and save that and head back to Unity and make sure we don't have any more errors. Okay, we have 3 more places. So this is in our melee attack state. Instead of saying entity.aliveGameObject.transform, we can just say entity.transform. And then the next one is in our dead state. So there's 2 over here. We can just remove both of those. And I think that should be everything. Let's see. Okay, perfect. So that gets rid of all of that. So now we can go ahead and add the core to our enemy1. So just right click on enemy1 and say create empty. And let's just rename that to core. And then I'm just going to drag it up and keep it at the top. And then we can come to the inspector and just say add component. And we just want to add our core script. Let's go ahead and come back to our entity script. And let's just add our core over here. So just say public core, and then give it a public getter and a private setter, just like that. Now we just need to go ahead and set this core component in our awake function. And I see here that I'm actually using start instead. So that's not right. Let's just go ahead and rename that to awake, like that. But that also means we'll have to come to our enemy1 and enemy2 scripts and change this from start to awake because it overrides. Perfect. Go ahead and close those 2. So in our awake function, before we do anything, we can go ahead and say that core equals get component in children. And the component type that we want to get is our core, like that. So now that we have our core here, again, we're going to make use of the core in our states like we do with our player. So let's go ahead and open up the base state script for our enemy. And we can just do the same thing. Come over here and just declare a protected core, call it core. And then in our constructor, we'll just say core equals entity.core, like that. So now all of our states have a reference to the enemy's core. Okay, so let's go ahead and make it so that our enemy makes use of our movement core component. So let's click on our core game object, right click and say create empty, and let's just call it movement. We can then go ahead and hit add component and just add our movement core component. Then let's come back to our entity script and get rid of all the things we no longer want in here. So the main thing is these 2 set velocity functions. Now there's one thing I just want to change real quick, and you'll see that our first set velocity function actually only sets the x velocity. So this is equivalent to our set velocity x function in our movement script. So I'm just going to hit F2 on this, or Control R, and I'm just going to add x at the end. That way I just know what I want to replace this with in the movement thing. Makes it a little bit easier. Don't confuse these 2. Okay, So now that this has been renamed in all of our states, we can just go ahead and delete both of these like that. Another thing that our movement script takes care of is flipping. So we can go ahead and get rid of this flip function like that. We can also come up to the very top and let's see what we can get rid of here. Let's just go ahead and open up our movement script so we can see. So you can see we have a rigid body and our facing direction. That's what we want our movement script to take care of. So we can get rid of both of those over here. So we're gonna have a nice lot of errors that we need to fix. Let's save this and take a look at Unity and see how many we have. So we have 20 errors. Easy. Okay. Let's start with the first one. Double click on that and see where it takes us. Okay, so in entity itself, we can go ahead and get rid of setting facing direction to 1 by default because that happens in the movement script. We can also get rid of this rigid body component. Now you can see over here in the update function, we set our animator's y velocity parameter to our rigid body.velocity.y. So let's just go ahead and fix this by saying core.movement.rb like that. Okay, let's see what other errors we have. Now it's mainly going to be our set velocity functions. So let's go ahead and select this entire entity.setVelocityX in our player detected state, hit Control F, and then hit the little arrow over here so we change it to find and replace mode. And now we just want to change this to core.movement.setVelocityX. And actually over here we want to get rid of that so that we replace all the set velocity x, not just the ones that set it to 0. And let's see if we can fix all of those. So boop, just keep hitting enter until we get all of them. No more have been found. Okay. Now we can just go ahead and hit Control K and then S to save everything. Come back to Unity. We only have 10 errors left. Perfect. Now before we fix any of the other errors, there's one more thing that we need to do. And that is we have to take a look at all of our set velocity x functions, and the ones that don't set it to 0, we actually have to multiply the parameter over here with our facing direction, because in our original set velocity function, we did that inside the function, but now we have to pass it through to the set velocity function. So let's go ahead and select our core.movement.setVelocityX and hit Control F, and let's just go ahead and look at all of them. So over here, we pass through our state data.movementSpeed. Let's just go ahead and say multiplied with core.movement.facing direction. Like that. Let's look at the next one. This one just uses 0, so it's fine. And the next one, and the next one. Okay. Here we have to multiply the same thing. So multiplied with core.movement.facing direction. Keep looking at all of them. And I think we got all of them. Okay, so now we can go ahead and look at the next set of errors. Okay, so here we have an issue with our entity.setVelocity. So let's go ahead and select that part, hit Control F, change it to find and replace mode. And now instead of core.movement.setVelocityX, it's just setVelocity again. And luckily the way we set this up is the same as we did in movements, so we don't have to change anything in here. Just go ahead and hit enter. And it seems that there was only 2 occurrences of those. Perfect. Now let's come back to Unity, see what else is wrong. Now it's with our flip function. So let's hit that. And instead of entity.flip, this is going to be core.movement.flip. But you'll see that this is still giving us an error. And that is just because in our movement script over here, we actually set our flip function private. But there's no real reason for it to be private. So let's just go ahead and change that to public now that we're actually going to use it. Okay, so our next entity.flip is in our E1 player detected state. Let's go ahead and change that to core.movement.flip. And actually, what am I doing? We should be searching for this. So Control F, and we're going to look for entity.flip like that. And we actually want to replace it with core.movement.flip. So replace, and hopefully that's all of them. Let's go ahead and hit Control K and then S to save everything, and then come back to Unity. Okay, so we only have 4 errors left, and this seems to be with our facing direction and our rigid body. So let's go ahead and click on that. And now instead of using entity.facing direction, let's select that, hit Control F, and we're just going to change it to core.movement.facing direction. Like that. Okay, so only one of them. Where's the other one? The other one is just in our entity itself. Okay. So over here, we just say core with a capital C, dot movement, dot facing direction with a capital F. Come back to Unity, hit the next error, and that is just with our rigid body in our entity script. So instead of using lowercase rb, we're going to use core dot movement dot uppercase rb. Like that. And then I'm just going to copy this and paste it for this rb. So let's come back to Unity real quick, and you'll see everything is fine, except we're going to get a couple of errors. So this error is saying object reference not set to an instance of an object. And if we click on that and see where it takes us, you'll see that it takes us to this onDrawGizmos function in our entity script. And that is just because now we're using this core.movement.facing direction over here, but when the game isn't running, this core is not set because we find it in the awake function. So to fix this, let's simply wrap this in an if statement. So if core does not equal null, then we can do this. So it's just a simple way of saying, well, you know, if this thing is going to give us an error, don't do it. So if we come back to Unity, you should see this error will disappear. There we go, we no longer get it. So that should be our movement setup for enemy 1. Let's go ahead and make sure that everything still works. So let's just run the game. So as you can see, we have a null reference exception and we are missing a core component. So we know now that this is happening over here. And this is happening because we have not yet set up the collision senses on our enemy. Now, we want to be able to test our movement without having set up the collision senses yet. So we're going to have to rethink what we're doing here a little bit. So this is actually pretty simple to do. And what we're going to do is just make use of our getters and setters up here instead of this over here. So instead of having this if statement that checks to see if either of these components are null and then giving us an error, let's go ahead and get rid of that and only give this error when we actually try and use one of these components. So if we try and get movement or collision senses and we don't have those set up, then we give the error. But that way we can test things without having all these components in place if nothing is using those components. So what we're going to do is, instead of having these auto-generated getters and private setters, we're going to make our own. So let's come below these variables and just declare a private movement, lowercase movement, and then a private collision senses, lowercase collision senses. Now let's start with our movement variable. So let's just go ahead and get rid of this, hit enter, create some new brackets, and then in here we just say get, and then open up some more squiggly brackets, hit enter, and it'll place it below it like that. And now in here we can just go ahead and say return movement. Then below this we can go ahead and just say private set. And in here all we say is movement equals value. Like that. So what you see here is basically exactly what this does, except it auto-generates these variables when the code gets compiled. But this means we can put some more of our own functionality in this get and set functions. So we're not actually going to do anything with our private setter. So just to make this a little bit nicer, let's go ahead and just make it a one-line thing again. Like that. But now for our getter, what we're going to do is we're going to check if movement equals null or not before we return it. And if it does equal null, that is when we give the error. So all we need to say is if not movement. So that means if movement does not equal null, then we'll go ahead and return movement. We can then come outside of this if statement and just say debug.log error. And the error we want to log is no movement core component on plus transform.parent.name. So this is going to get the name of the parent of our core, which in our case should be enemy1 or player or whatever, like that. And then we can just go ahead and say return null, because we need to have a return statement. So all this means is if we don't have a movement component attached to any of our entities, but we're not making use of it, it'll still work, and we'll just get an error if we are trying to use it. Let's go ahead and do the exact same thing for our collision senses. Now there's no real reason to rewrite all of it, so let's just go ahead and copy it, minimize this. Let's go ahead and then get rid of this getter and setter, open up some brackets, paste this in, and now just fix the variables being used. So instead of movement, this is going to be collision senses, and then we're going to return collision senses. And over here, this also needs to be collision senses. Now our log error, instead of movement, should also say collision senses, like that. So now you'll see if we come back to Unity, we won't have any errors, or we shouldn't if we did everything right. Oh, nope, we still have a lot of errors. Okay, so it turns out that I was actually wrong about this, and this does not seem to work. So instead of saying not movement, we have to say movement does not equal null. And then the same thing for collision senses. So collision senses does not equal null. Okay, sorry about that. This should work now. So if we come back to Unity and we go ahead and run the game, cool, everything works. I don't know why I keep getting this crafts edge.wakeup error, but that's not anything for us. Okay, so if you take a look at our enemy, he's still moving. So he's making use of our movement core component now. That is beautiful. And it's cool because he's not making use of the collision senses, but everything is still working. No errors, nothing's breaking. Perfect, so let's move on. The next thing we need to work on is our collision senses. So let's go ahead and click on our core component again underneath our enemy one, right click and say create empty. And let's just rename this to collision senses. Like that. We can then go ahead and hit add component and look for our collision senses component. And as you can see, we have all these references to set up. So let's go ahead and just get our ground check and our wall check and ledge check. And let's make them children of our collision senses. Now, as you can see, we also have this touch damage check and player check and all those things. We're going to be making a whole different core component for those things. So for now, it's just our collision senses, which just handles any collisions with the world around it. So we have our ground check. We can go ahead and put that in ground check, and then our wall check in wall check. And now next, we need to be careful because we have this ledge check over here and a ledge check variable, but they're actually two different ledge checks. This ledge check was set up for our player, which is the check that we do to see if we can climb onto a ledge. And this ledge check that the enemy has is the check going down over here to make sure that it doesn't walk off any ledges. So I think we have to update our movement script to account for this. So let's come back over here. Let's go to our core component movement script. Sorry, not our movement script, our collision senses script. So let's open up that and let's just go ahead and clean up here, right click on our tab and say close all but this, just so that we have a little bit less going on. Now over here we have this ledge boolean. So I'm just gonna go ahead and rename this to ledge horizontal. Just so I know what's going on. That means I gotta come up here to my check transforms and rename these appropriately as well. So ledge check is going to become ledge check horizontal. And the lowercase ledge check, the same thing. So ledge check horizontal, just like that. Perfect. So now we won't get confused about that anymore. But this means we now need to make a vertical ledge check as well. So let's just come below our horizontal ledge check and create another serialized field, private transform ledge check vertical. And then we can come and create the public getter and setter for that. So public transform ledge check vertical. And get is our ledge check vertical. And private set is also ledge check vertical equals value. Now the last thing we need to do is come down here and just create another public bool called ledge vertical, like that, and the getter simply returns physics2d dot raycast, and then we're going to raycast from our ledge check vertical dot position, and it's going to cast in the vector2 dot down direction, and the distance is just going to be our wall check distance as well, and then our layer mask is going to be what is ground, just like that. So that means we can come back to our enemy, come to our collision senses component, and just drag in our ledge check into our ledge check vertical slot. We can then set our ground check radius to 0.3 and our wall check distance to 0.2 and our what is ground to ground. Now, so because we renamed our ledge check to ledge check horizontal, that just means we have to come to our player real quick, to our collision senses component here, and reassign our ledge check game object. So we're using the ledge check horizontal. So now before we can run the game and see what happens, we need to actually make our enemy use our collision senses. So to do that, let's come back to our entity script, which is over here. And all we need to do is come down to our check wall, check ledge, and check ground functions and get rid of these three. And let's save this and let's see what wonderful errors we have. Only 7, so it's not bad at all. Let's start with the first one. So there is no accessible check ground function. So now we know that entity.checkGround, this needs to be replaced with core.collisionSenses.ground. And so now because ground is a property, we don't have to add the brackets at the end over here. Okay, so let's just go ahead and hit enter until all of those are gone. It seems like there's only 2. Perfect. Let's hit Control K and then S to save that. And let's go back to Unity and see what else we can fix. So over here, it's our check ledge. So let's select that, hit Control F. I'm going to replace this with core.collisionSenses dot, and instead of ground, it's going to be ledge vertical. Like that. So hit enter, and enter, and enter. And it looks like there's 3 of those. Perfect. Control K and then S. And then next, it's going to be our check wall. So over here we have our entity.check wall, but I notice here that I misspelt is detecting ledge over here. So let's just go ahead and fix that too. So it should be is detecting ledge. So let's select this entity.check wall, hit Control F, and we're changing this to core.collisionSenses.wall front. Like that. Okay, so there goes those 2. And this might be everything. Let's see. Yep, that's all of it. Perfect. Let's run the game and see if our enemy makes use of our collision senses perfectly. So as you can see, he's not quite working correctly yet. Let's investigate and see what the issues might be. If we take a look at our collision senses, I'm suspecting it might be our wall check distance. Let's just change this to 0.3 and see what happens. Yep, okay, so that seemed to have been the issue. Nice. Okay, so our enemy is now making use of our collision senses. Perfect. The only issue I have right now is the fact that we have this component again with these empty transforms over here that don't have anything in it. So let's just go ahead and be proactive about this and make it so that if our enemy was to try and use this ceiling check, which it doesn't have, that we get an error so that me, when I'm building the game or creating new enemies later down the line, knows, okay, I have to add a ceiling check. So to do this, let's come back to our script and let's take a look at our collision senses script. And the simplest way to fix it here is to add the same kind of error checking that we did on our core script over here for our transforms. So for these ones, because then we can come down to our checks over here, and instead of using the lowercase versions, we'll use the uppercase versions, and then we'll get 2 birds with 1 stone, because we will get an error if we try to check our ceiling over here, and we'll also get an error if we just try and look at the transform. Okay, so let's just start with our ground check. The simplest thing to do is just to get rid of this ground check over here and leave the private set as it is. Let's just open up some brackets, press enter there. The formatting is going to be a little bit weird, but once we start writing some stuff, we can format it. Perfect. Now inside of this get, we'll just say if ground check, then we're going to return our ground check. And so I just realized why I messed up with the previous one is because I was saying not in front of the variable name, but it should just be like this without that there. Okay, that makes sense. I'm really dumb sometimes. And now actually, because we only have a single statement here inside the if statement, we can just go ahead and get rid of the brackets just to condense the code a little bit. So if that, then we return ground check. Otherwise, we're going to say debug.log error. And the error that we're going to log is that there is no ground check on. And the component that it's on is going to be our core.transform.parent.name. Like that. Then we just want to go ahead and return null because we need to have a return statement everywhere. So perfect, just like that. Let's just go ahead and copy this get statement. And then we can collapse our ground check. And let's go ahead and do the same thing for our wall check. So I'm just going to select the get statement over here and then hit Control V, paste it in. There we go, the formatting's good. So now instead of ground check, it's going to be wall check like that. And then we return wall check. And then we'll say that there is no wall check on our game object. Go ahead and collapse that. And now we can do our ledge check horizontal. So select the get, hit Control V, paste that in. Perfect. Now instead of ground check, it's going to be ledge check horizontal, and no ledge check horizontal. Like that. Now we can do our ledge check vertical. So select the get statement, Control V, ledge check vertical, and then finally no ledge check vertical on our game object. And now finally we have our ceiling check. So go ahead and select get, Control V, and now if ceiling check, then return ceiling check. Otherwise, let us know that there is no ceiling check. Just like that. Okay, so now that we have this in place, we just have to come down to our properties and then change these to their uppercase counterparts. So ceiling check becomes ceiling check, ground check becomes ground check, wall check is wall check, ledge check is ledge check, and ledge check, and finally wall check again. Perfect. Okay, so now we have another thing set in place where we can feel a little bit more safe about what we're working with. Let's just go ahead and run the game and make sure everything still works. If we take a look at our enemy, he still detects the wall, he turns around. Perfect. Beautiful. I love it. Okay, so we've basically set up our movement and collision senses for enemy 1. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for enemy 2 real quick. So let's go ahead and re-enable enemy 2. And now the first thing we want to do is copy our enemy 2 script like we did for enemy 1. So click on the 3 dots, hit copy component, come down to the alive game object, hit anywhere and just say paste component as new. It has everything pulled in, perfect. We can then go ahead and just drag it up into its own thing and delete enemy 2, and then come back to the alive game object and rename it to enemy 2, like that. So now we can click on our enemy 2 game object and hit create empty. And let's just go ahead and rename this to core, and then hit add component, select core, just like that, and drag it up to the top. Next, we can right click on core and say create empty. And this is going to be our movement core component. So movement, we can then say add component, movement like that. And then finally, we can right click on core again, create empty, and say collision senses. We can then hit add component, look for collision senses, and let's just go ahead and drag all these things in. So we have our ledge check, wall check, and ground check. Let's make them children of collision senses, and then drag those in. So ledge check vertical for the enemies, wall check, and ground check. We can then set our ground check radius to 0.3, our wall check distance to 0.3, and what is ground to ground, just like that. Let's save that and see if our enemy 2 works. Detects the ledge, turns around, perfect, everything's working. So awesome, that was pretty seamless to make our enemies use our core movement and collision senses objects. In the next episode, we're going to start working on our combat and stats core components. This is going to allow us to make the player hit the enemy and have the enemy hit the player. And we're going to do a bunch of fun little things with that. So for now, that's going to be it for this episode. I hope you guys managed to learn something new. I hope you like the system that we're working on. If you guys have any suggestions to things that we can do differently or improve on, or if you notice anything that, I might be doing wrong, please let me know. I'm always open to suggestions and fixing mistakes from the past. So yeah, before I go, I would just like to thank all of my supporters and wonderful people over on Patreon. You guys are amazing. And a huge special thank you to all of the absolute mad lads over on Patreon, and that is Pyro Says, Cody Lee, Binary Chef SA, Jeremiah Miranda, Clean Vassner, Samoon, Alex from Okida, I hope I'm saying that right, TomTom, and Peter Smith. You guys are awesome, and I love you, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful day.